The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves as we piled onto the hay wagon, the wooden boards creaking under our weight. It was the last hayride of the night, the one whispered about in town as something more than just a Halloween attraction. I was the one who pushed for us to go. I wanted to see if the stories were true. The others agreed, though with less enthusiasm, but who could resist the lure of the haunted hayride through Blackwood Farm? The place had a reputation, to say the least. Blackwood Farm had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last family to live there vanished without a trace. Over the years, people claimed to see strange lights in the fields, hear disembodied voices on the wind, and even catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving between the dead trees. The story said that every Halloween, the spirits of the missing would return, and those unlucky enough to cross their path might never return. I dismissed it all as town legend, the kind of tale people tell to keep the kids in line. The tractor roared to life and we jolted forward, hay scratching at our legs. The night was cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, but the excitement in the air kept us warm. Around us, other groups laughed nervously, their voices carrying into the dark. But as we left the main road and the farm came into view, a hush fell over the crowd. The farm loomed ahead, the skeletal remains of barns and sheds casting long shadows across the fields. The moonlight filtered through the bare trees, creating twisted patterns on the ground. The only sound was the steady chug of the tractor's engine and the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath the wheels. Then the actors started to appear. At first, it was typical haunted hayride fare. Figures in tattered clothes, their faces smeared with makeup, groaning as they stumbled out of the cornfields. But as we went deeper into the farm, the atmosphere began to change. The actors got closer, their movements more deliberate, their eyes too intense. There was something in their stares, something that felt wrong. A man in overalls, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, reached out to us, his fingers almost brushing my arm. His eyes were hollow, like he was staring right through me, and his mouth moved soundlessly. I looked away, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. I reminded myself it was all part of the show, but I couldn't help but notice that his breath fogged the air, as if he were alive. Yet the cold seemed to pass right through him. We passed a dilapidated barn, and that's when I noticed something else. The hayride route was leading us away from the main attraction area, deeper into the farm's abandoned acreage. The others started to notice too, whispering among themselves, but no one wanted to admit we were lost. The actors followed us, their footsteps soundless, their faces shrouded in darkness, yet every time I looked back, they were closer. Suddenly, the tractor jerked to a stop. The driver, an older man with a face like weathered stone, stood and motioned for us to stay put. He muttered something about a problem with the engine, but his voice was too low, too shaky. The other riders exchanged uneasy glances. There was no one to come rescue us, no other tractors in sight. The only thing around was the black, empty fields and the figures that lingered just at the edge of the light. A scream pierced the night, sharp and shrill, cutting through the tension like a knife. I whipped my head around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the source of the scream was nowhere to be seen. The others on the hayride started to panic, their voices rising in fear. That's when the actors moved in closer, no longer stumbling but walking with purpose. Their hands reached out cold and clammy, their eyes dead and unblinking. Something was wrong. These weren't just actors playing a role. They were too real, too solid. I watched in horror as one of the figures grabbed a girl sitting near the back of the wagon. She screamed, thrashing, but his grip was unyielding. And then, as if he were dragging her through water, she began to sink into the ground, her screams muffled by the earth swallowing her whole. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't part of the show. This was something else, something much worse. I scrambled to my feet, shouting for the others to run, but the hayride had become a death trap. The figures surrounded us, their ghostly forms solidifying, their eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. As I turned to jump from the wagon, I caught sight of the driver. He was standing off to the side, his face expressionless as he watched the chaos unfold. And then he smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a chill through my soul. This was what he had been waiting for. We weren't just on a haunted hayride. We were the latest victims in Blackwood Farm's curse. Before I could react, cold hands wrapped around my ankle, yanking me down. I hit the hay hard, my vision blurring as figures loomed over me. They leaned in close, their breath icy against my skin, and I realized with dawning horror that the stories were true. The spirits of Blackwood Farm weren't just restless, they were hungry. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the driver, tipping his hat in mock salute as the spirits began to pull me into the earth, just like the girl before. And then everything went black. I awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. My body ached all over, the cold from the damp ground seeping into my bones. I wasn't on the hayride anymore. I was lying in the middle of a field, surrounded by rows of corn that towered above me like ominous sentinels. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense stalks, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed with every gust of wind. Panic gripped my chest as I scrambled to my feet, memories of the hayride flooding back. The spirits, the screams, the driver's cold, cruel smile, it all felt like a nightmare. But this was no dream. I was alone, and the silence was suffocating. I spun around trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked the same. The cornfield stretched endlessly, a maze designed to trap and disorient. My heart pounded in my ears, and I started walking, hoping to find the others or at least a way out. The stalks brushed against my arms as I moved, the dry leaves whispering secrets in the dark. As I walked, I noticed the temperature dropping, the air turning frigid. My breath came out in puffs of mist, and the once distant rustling grew louder, more deliberate. I wasn't alone. Something was moving through the corn, just out of sight, keeping pace with me. I quickened my steps, the fear gnawing at my sanity. The rustling grew closer, and then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, taunting. I broke into a run, the cornstalk slashing at my face and arms as I pushed forward, desperate to escape whatever was hunting me. The ground beneath my feet grew uneven, the soft earth giving way to something harder. I stumbled, nearly falling into a shallow pit filled with broken stones and brittle bones. My stomach churned at the sight, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't the first to end up here. This was a graveyard hidden within the cornfield where the farm's victims had been discarded like trash. I had to get out. I turned to run again, but froze as a figure stepped out from the corn, blocking my path. It was one of the actors, or rather, one of the spirits. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his skull, eyes sunken and void of life. He wore the same tattered overalls, but now they were stained with blood, dark and dried. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, but my foot caught on a root and I fell hard onto the stones. Pain shot through my leg, but I barely noticed. My mind was too consumed with the figure advancing on me, his lips curling into a grin that was far too wide, far too unnatural. He raised his hand, and that's when I saw the knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. Blood dripped from its edge, and I knew it wasn't just for show. This was how they claimed their victims, how they added to their ranks. My heart raced as I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the dirt and rocks. Just as he lunged, there was a flash of movement from the corner of my eye. Another figure barreled into him, knocking the knife from his hand and sending him sprawling into the pit. I blinked in shock as I realized it was one of my friends, the one who had been sitting next to me on the hayride. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with mud and blood, but he was alive. He reached down, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "We have to go," he panted, his voice strained with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. Together, we turned and fled deeper into the cornfield, the rustling and whispers growing louder, more frenzied, as the spirits pursued us. We ran until our lungs burned, the cold air cutting through us like knives. The corn seemed endless, the rows stretching on forever, but we didn't stop. The whispers were right behind us, the spirits closing in, their inhuman voices blending into a cacophony of terror. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, the cornfield abruptly ended, giving way to an open space. We stumbled into a clearing, the full moon illuminating the scene in stark, cold light. In the center stood the old farmhouse, its windows dark and broken, the wood rotting and sagging with age. It looked abandoned, but we had no other choice. The whispers were closing in, the figures emerging from the corn one by one, their eyes glowing with a pale, ghostly light. We bolted for the farmhouse, the door hanging off its hinges. As we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but there was no time to rest. The spirits were out there, circling the house, their whispers seeping through the walls like poison. My friend moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice trembling. "They'll find a way in." But before we could make a plan, the house began to creak and shift, the walls shuddering as if alive. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, and the temperature plummeted. The floor beneath us started to buckle, and with a sickening crack, the boards gave way, plunging us into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. My head swam as I tried to push myself up, but the world spun, and I collapsed back onto the cold, damp earth. I could hear my friend groaning nearby, struggling to stand. As my vision cleared, I realized we were in the basement, or what was left of it. The walls were crumbling, the stones slick with moisture, and the air was filled with the stench of rot. And then I saw them, rows upon rows of bodies laid out on the dirt floor, their faces twisted in terror. The missing townsfolk, the ones who had disappeared over the years, their souls now trapped in the cornfield above. But these bodies weren't just decaying, they were moving. Limbs twitched, fingers clawed at the earth, and eyes, long dead, flickered open. The whispers became deafening, the voices of the dead rising in a chorus of rage and despair. The spirits hadn't just come to claim us, they were welcoming us to their ranks. And then from the far corner of the room, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was the driver, his face now twisted with a malevolent grin. He held a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls, and in his other hand, he held a long, rusted blade. "Welcome to Blackwood Farm," he said, his voice echoing through the basement like a death knell. "You're just in time for the harvest." Before we could react, the spirits surged forward, their icy hands grabbing at our legs, pulling us down into the earth. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me once again was the driver, raising his blade high above his head, his eyes burning with a hunger that would never be satisfied. Darkness surrounded me, cold and suffocating, as I felt myself being pulled deeper into the earth. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, a deafening roar in my ears. My body was numb, and I couldn't tell if I was still sinking or if I had already become part of the dirt beneath the haunted farm. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, only the oppressive weight of the soil pressing in on all sides as if the earth itself was swallowing me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pulling sensation stopped. I gasped, drawing in a ragged breath as the pressure around me eased. My senses returned in a rush, and I found myself lying on the cold, hard ground, my limbs trembling uncontrollably. I forced my eyes open, but the darkness was impenetrable, so thick that I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of where I was. The last thing I remembered was being dragged into the basement of the farmhouse, surrounded by the restless dead. The driver's mocking voice echoed in my mind, and I shuddered at the memory of his blade glinting in the lantern's light. But now everything was silent, the air still and stale. Slowly I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my fingers scraping against rough stone. As I struggled to stand, a dim light appeared in the distance, flickering weakly like a dying flame. It was barely enough to illuminate the space around me, but it was better than the suffocating blackness. I stumbled toward it, every step feeling like an eternity as my legs threatened to give out beneath me. As I drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the grim reality of where I had ended up. I was in a narrow, tunnel-like passage, the walls made of crumbling stone and packed earth. The ceiling was low, forcing me to hunch over as I moved forward. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every breath felt like inhaling death itself. The tunnel twisted and turned, the light guiding me deeper into the bowels of the earth. I had no idea where it was leading me, but I couldn't stay where I was. The fear of what lurked in the darkness behind me pushed me onward, even as the dread of what lay ahead gnawed at my resolve. Eventually, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat at the sight before me. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with old, rotting wooden beams that barely held up the ceiling. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Around it stood several figures, their backs to me, clad in tattered robes that looked like they had been pulled from graves long forgotten. I recognized the figures immediately, the same spirits that had haunted the hayride, the ones that had pulled me and my friend into this nightmare. They stood motionless, their heads bowed as if in prayer, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls. My eyes were drawn to the altar, where something or someone was lying. I took a hesitant step forward, trying to get a better look, and the figure on the altar shifted, letting out a low, guttural moan. My blood ran cold as I realized it was my friend, the one who had saved me earlier. His clothes were torn and bloodied, his face pale and twisted in pain. I tried to call out to him, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. If I moved any closer, the spirits would surely notice me, but I couldn't just leave him there. As I hesitated, the figures around the altar began to move, raising their hands in unison. They started to chant in a language I didn't understand, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the chamber with a sinister energy. The light above the altar brightened, revealing the true horror of the scene. The spirits weren't just performing a ritual, they were preparing a sacrifice. My friend's eyes fluttered open, his gaze locking with mine for a brief moment, and I saw the terror in his eyes. He was too weak to speak, but his expression said it all. He knew what was coming, and he knew there was no escape. Desperation surged through me, and I clenched my fists, trying to summon the courage to do something, anything to save him. But before I could move, the chanting stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. The spirits lowered their hands, and the leader of the group, A tall, gaunt figure with a face hidden beneath a hood stepped forward, holding a long, curved blade. Time seemed to slow as the blade was raised high above the altar, the dim light catching its edge. My mind screamed for me to do something, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and helplessness. The leader brought the blade down in a swift, brutal arc, and I turned away, unable to watch the inevitable. But before the blade could strike, there was a deafening crash that shook the entire chamber. The walls trembled, dust raining down from the ceiling, and the spirits recoiled, their ritual disrupted. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and saw the entrance to the chamber had collapsed, rocks and debris blocking the only exit. The spirits turned their attention to the collapse, their once cohesive movements now disjointed and frantic. The leader snarled in frustration, raising the blade once more, but this time it wasn't directed at my friend. It was aimed at me. He moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward as the blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing my face. I tripped over a loose stone, falling to the ground, and the leader loomed over me, his hood slipping back to reveal a face twisted by centuries of rage and torment. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the slick stones, but there was nowhere to go. The other spirits were closing in, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger, their ghostly forms solidifying into something far more terrifying. The leader raised the blade again, a sneer curling his lips. And then, from somewhere deep within the earth, a low, rumbling sound began to build, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. The spirits hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. The ground beneath us started to shake, the walls of the chamber groaning under the pressure. Without warning, the floor beneath the altar cracked open, and a gaping chasm split the room in two. The spirits howled in fury, their forms becoming more translucent as the light from the chasm grew brighter and brighter. The leader staggered backward, his blade clattering to the ground, his face contorted in terror. I seized the opportunity and scrambled to my feet, grabbing my friend by the arm and dragging him away from the altar. The light from the chasm grew blinding, filling the entire chamber with a searing white glow. The spirits wailed in agony, their forms disintegrating into nothingness as the light consumed them. The ground continued to shake, and I knew we had to move quickly. The collapse had blocked the only exit, but the chasm offered a way out, if we could survive the drop. I dragged my friend to the edge, the heat from the light nearly unbearable, and without a second thought I jumped, pulling him with me into the abyss. As we fell, the world around us dissolved into a blur of light and sound, the ground rushing up to meet us far too quickly. The last thing I heard before the darkness claimed me once again was the echo of the spirits' screams, growing fainter and fainter until they were nothing more than a distant memory. And then there was silence. I hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The darkness closed in for a moment, swallowing me whole, but then, just as quickly, it retreated. I groaned, every muscle in my body aching as I forced myself to sit up. My head throbbed, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten here. But then it all came flooding back. The hayride, the spirits, the collapsing chamber. My heart raced as I looked around trying to get my bearings. The chasm we had fallen into was gone, replaced by a soft grassy field bathed in the golden light of dawn. The air was cool and fresh, the smell of earth and leaves a stark contrast to the decay and death I had just escaped. I blinked, unable to believe what I was seeing. It was as if the nightmare had never happened, as if I had somehow been transported to another world. But then I heard a soft groan beside me and turned to see my friend lying on the ground, his face pale but alive. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I scrambled to his side, my hands shaking as I checked him for injuries. He was bruised and battered, but there were no serious wounds. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. "We made it," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We're out." He blinked, trying to process my words, and then a weak smile spread across his face. How did we... "I don't know," I admitted, shaking my head. "But we're alive, and that's all that matters." I helped him to his feet, and together we surveyed our surroundings. The field stretched out in all directions, bordered by a dense forest. There was no sign of the farmhouse, no sign of the spirits or the horrors we had just endured. It was as if we had been dropped into a different reality, one where the nightmare couldn't reach us. We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us trying to make sense of what had happened. But the longer we stood there, the more the tension and fear began to melt away. The warmth of the sun on our faces, the gentle rustling of the trees, the soft chirping of birds. It was all so normal, so peaceful, that it was hard to believe we had just been fighting for our lives. "I don't think we'll ever understand what happened back there," my friend said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. but I don't want to stick around to find out. Let's get out of here. I nodded in agreement. We had been given a second chance, and I wasn't about to waste it. We started walking, moving away from the field and toward the forest, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. The journey was slow, our bodies still aching from the ordeal, but with every step, the weight of the past few hours lifted a little more. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the spirits chasing after us. But there was nothing, just the empty field and the rising sun. The nightmare was over. We had escaped. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us like ancient guardians, but the path was clear and easy to follow. The sounds of the forest were a comforting backdrop, and for the first time since the hayride began, I felt a sense of peace. We walked in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts, until finally we emerged onto a small country road. A wave of relief washed over me as I saw the road stretching out before us, leading back to the world we knew. It was a simple, unremarkable road, but to us it was a lifeline, a connection to safety and normalcy. We followed the road for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky until finally we saw a car approaching in the distance. I raised my hand, waving frantically, and the car slowed to a stop beside us. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, looked at us with concern. "You kids all right?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine worry. We're fine," I stammered, not even sure how to explain what had happened. "We just got lost." The man nodded, seeming to understand that there was more to the story than we were letting on. "Well, hop in, I'll give you a ride to town." We climbed into the car, the soft seats a welcome comfort after everything we had been through. As the car pulled away, I looked out the window, watching the forest fade into the distance. The memories of the night were already beginning to blur, like a bad dream that fades with the morning light. My friend leaned back in the seat, closing his eyes with a sigh of relief. "We made it," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "We really made it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The fear and terror of the night still clung to me, but with every passing mile it faded a little more. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side. We were survivors. As we drove away from Blackwood Farm, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. Whatever had happened that night, whatever malevolent forces had tried to claim us, they had failed. We were free, and the nightmare was over. The road ahead was long, but it was bathed in the warm light of the rising sun, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe that everything was going to be all right. The haunted hayride was behind us, and the future stretched out before us, bright and full of promise.